Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Maine State Solve Climate by 2030 Dialogue. My name is Bethany Woodworth, and I am professor of the School of Marine and Environmental Programs here at UNE and coordinator of UNE's minor in climate change studies. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Wabanaki Nation, which includes the Abenaki, Micmac, Maliseet, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy people, on whose ancient and sacred land we live, work, and play. As a community, we recognize the ever-present systemic inequities that stem directly from past wrongdoing, and we commit ourselves indefinitely to respecting and reconciling this long history of injustice. The Solve Climate by 2030 event that you are attending this evening is actually part of an international network of over 100 dialogues designed to promote conversations between youth, community members, and climate leaders on how to address climate change while creating much needed jobs and responding to societal inequities. Our panel this evening includes 4 of Maine's most prominent climate leaders. Hannah Pingree, Director of the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future. Molly and Dana, Penobscot Nation Ambassador. Anya Wright, climate change grassroots organizer from Sierra Club, Maine. And David Costello, Climate and Clean Energy Director of the Natural Resource Council of Maine. Each of our panelists will speak in turn for about 10 minutes about their visions for solving the problem of climate change in Maine. This will be followed by an open discussion moderated by Charles Tilburg, Academic Director of the School of Marine and Environmental Programs at the University of New England. We encourage you to enter your questions for the panelists into the chat at the bottom of the page, and Charles will pose them to our panelists at the
Sorry, I'm not sure what happened there, but through the lovely pleasures of Zoom, we are back on. And floor is back to you there, Bethany. Oh, Bethany, you are muted. Please unmute. Let's take 2 on this one. Here we go. Action.
From the beginning.
There you go.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Maine State Solve Climate by 2030 Dialogue. My name is Bethany Woodworth, and I'm a professor at the University of New England in the School of Marine and Environmental Programs, and I'm also coordinator of UNE's minor in climate change studies. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Wabanaki Nation, which includes the Abenaki, Micmac, Maliseet, Penobscot, and Passamaquoddy people, on whose ancient and sacred land we live, work, and play. As a community, we recognize the ever-present systemic inequities that stem directly from past wrongdoing, and we commit ourselves indefinitely to respecting and reconciling this long history of injustice. The Solve Climate by 2030 event that you are attending this evening is part of an international network of over 100 dialogues designed to promote conversations between youth, community members, and climate leaders on how to address climate change while creating much-needed jobs and responding to societal inequities. Our panel this evening includes 4 of Maine's most prominent climate leaders: Hannah Pingree, Director of the Governor's Office of Policy Innovation in the Future; Molly and Dana, Penobscot Nation Ambassador; Anya Wright, Grassroots Climate Organizer for Sierra Club Maine; and David Costello, Climate and Clean Energy Director of the Natural Resources Council of Maine. Each of our panelists will speak in turn for about 10 minutes about their visions for solving the problem of climate change in Maine. This will be followed by an open discussion moderated by Dr. Charles Tilburg, Academic Director of the School of Marine and Environmental Programs here at UNE. We encourage you to enter your questions for the panelists into the chat at the bottom of the page, and Charles will pose those questions to the panelists during the second hour. We will now have our welcome from the University of New England Interim Provost, Dr. Karen Pardue. Thank you.
Thank you, Bethany. Good evening, everyone. My name is Karen Pardue, and I am the Interim Provost at the University of New England. And I am so pleased to welcome you to tonight's webinar. I apologize for a few of our technical difficulties, and I appreciate all of your patience as we enter this really exciting evening, as we think about the fact that this event is occurring in a near simultaneous way, as we just heard from Bethany, all across the 50 states of the United States and up to 50 countries around the world. UNE is certainly proud and honored to have been selected to host the State of Maine discussion. Maine is keenly aware of the urgency of climate work. Our state is characterized by pristine forests, rugged coastlines, extraordinary beaches, a robust fishing industry, breathtaking woodlands with iconic species, and local farms, all of which depend upon a strong, healthy, and vibrant ecosystem. Governor Mills and the Maine legislature demonstrated their resolve in 2019 through creating the Maine Climate Council. The council subsequently submitted a 4-year climate action plan that I familiarized myself with, and their work is remarkable. They put a blueprint forth to put Maine on a trajectory to decrease greenhouse gas emissions by 45% in 2030 and by 80% in 2050. Their report contains abundant strategies entitled Maine Won't Wait, and it highlights specific initiatives, including reducing transportation emissions, modernizing Maine buildings to address our 4-season needs for heating, cooling, and lighting, applying climate research to Maine's working land and water environments in support of fishing, aquaculture, and tourism, and advancing community awareness and action regarding the challenges and opportunities posed by climate change. Climate change certainly represents a complex and interconnected social, environmental, scientific, and epistemological problem. As such, no one discipline holds ability to tackle all alone the challenges posed by climate change. Instead, this complexity is going to require an interdisciplinary approach, bringing together our legislators, scientists, policymakers, educators, people from the fishing and forest industry, health and human services, transportation, business and manufacturing, community leaders, and all citizens of Maine. This transdisciplinary collaboration is essential to harness the diverse knowledge bases, action strategies, and value systems that are needed to shift towards a sustainable future. The University of New England is deeply committed to this important work. Our strategic plan reflects our profound concern and respect for the health of individuals, the health of our communities, the health of our environment, and the health of our planet. We're also committed to interdisciplinary collaborative problem-solving approaches as we work to address real-world problems that face people, society, and our planet. As noted by Bethany, tonight we welcome 4 distinguished experts who will share their perspective and experience in combating climate change here in Maine. Tonight's event will arm us with concrete, tangible strategies that each of us can adopt for our own personal climate action plan. In closing, I'm both pleased and honored to welcome you to this important event. I would like to now introduce a brief video which will set the stage for tonight's discussion. Thank you.
Welcome to the Solve Climate Global Dialogues. You're participating in one of 125 events held across the planet, including in almost all 50 U.S. states, part of a global project called Solve Climate by 2030. My name is Goodstein, and I'm an economist and director of the Graduate Programs in Sustainability at Bard College in New York, the lead organizer for Solve Climate. This last year has been difficult for everyone. As the world looks forward to recovery from COVID, we are focusing tonight on the most important question facing humanity. What can we do in this year in our regions to help solve climate change while supporting struggling communities that have faced widespread loss of life, economic disaster, and joblessness? Worldwide, from Australia to Kyrgyzstan, from Colombia to Malaysia, and from South Carolina to South Africa, Solve Climate audiences are hearing from local experts and young leaders about concrete steps that can really help nations solve climate change while creating much needed jobs and incomes for everybody. The year 2020 was one of the 2 hottest years in human history, bringing with it massive forest and grassland fires, record-breaking storms and hurricanes, and relentless rising seas. Solving climate is the challenge which the human species must now face. There's hope for the future. Solutions have continued to advance. This year, China committed to building a carbon-neutral economy, while the U.S. rejoined the Paris Agreement. Solar, wind, and battery prices continue to fall, while major car companies have been rushing to electrify the global fleet. Worldwide, movements for Black Lives Matter and Me Too are leading in bringing much delayed and urgently needed justice to the world. Time is short. We have until 2030, 10 years to solve climate. We can get a lot done in this decade. We have the solutions, but only if we focus the world on climate solutions and justice, and then do the work we have to do in our own cities and regions. For students listening, you are the leaders. Without you, the future we envision will not come. I'm asking tonight for your help. We're going to discover powerful ideas for climate solutions and climate justice, and how you can be a part of the solution. But this message must reach beyond those of us who are listening right now. Would you ask all your teachers this week in every subject to make climate a class? The teacher can assign tonight's webinars homework for the students, and then afterwards have a one-class period discussion. And we mean every subject, from art to engineering, psychology to business, dance to chemistry. Teachers don't need to be a climate expert to lead a discussion about climate change. The Solve Climate project has easy-to-use teacher's guides in nearly every subject and in 3 languages to help teachers make climate relevant to their class. It only takes courage. Don't take no for an answer. Ask them, why not? This is your future. You'll be surprised how many teachers will say yes and thank you. Imagine you, thousands of leaders like you around the world asking their teachers once every school term to make climate a class. That means every term going forwards, hundreds of thousands, millions of students worldwide in their classes talking about climate solutions. COVID has shown how fragile our global economy and society are to extreme events. It's also shown that vulnerable people are facing the hardest, most damaging impacts. This is also true with climate change. Science has made it clear that unchecked, global warming will mean an unending onslaught of extreme events, causing untold suffering for humanity and all creatures, species driven to extinction, a planet of environmental refugees. And yet, in many ways, this is the most exciting time to ever be alive as a human. We have the tools and networks and technologies to rewire the world with clean energy, reimagine the global food system, reinvent transportation, and regenerate forests and grasslands, and be well on our way to solving climate by 2030. Tonight, we will learn how to do this in our own cities, our own towns, our own regions. Thank you for the work you will do to promote climate solutions and a just world.
So, as Dr. Woodworth said, I'm Charles Tilburg, the Academic Director of the School of Marine and Environmental Programs here at the University of New England. And I could not be more excited to hear from our four wonderful panelists who agreed to come speak to us. As a reminder, each panelist will speak for about 10 minutes. After we've heard from all four of our panelists, we'll have approximately 30 minutes for questions and discussions. So as you listen to the panelists, excuse me, please ask your questions using the chat function. So I'd first like to introduce our first panelist, Hannah Pingree. So Ms. Pingree is the current director of Governor Mills' Office of Policy, Innovation, and the Future, as well as the co-chair of the Maine Climate Council. Ms. Pingree previously served as the Speaker of the Maine House of Representatives, the Maine House Majority Leader, the Chair of the Committee on Health and Human Services, and a member of the Committee on Appropriations and Financial Affairs during her terms in the Maine legislature. She spearheaded successful legislation on energy, broadband, housing, environmental health, and healthcare during her time in office. Ms. Pingree has worked for a technology startup firm in New York City, managed several small family businesses, led the development of rural housing, energy efficiency, and elder care projects for a coalition of community nonprofits, chaired her local school board, and served on numerous state and community nonprofit boards. So without further ado, I present Ms. Hannah Pingree.
Great, thank you, Charles. I am trying to start my video. It says the host has disabled it. So I'm just gonna ask I'm happy to hide out here. This is actually awesome, but there I am. So again, thank you, Charles. I'm assuming, can you tell me you can see my screen?
You can see your screen.
Okay, great. Well, it's great to be here. It's great to be here with UNE and the leadership that this university has provided. Obviously, it's exciting to be, part of an event where so many states around the country and so many different events are happening, because I think I don't need to tell anybody who's attending that climate is a crisis and it is a big deal. And it's a really important time to focus effort on how we can make a difference. I'm excited to be here with Ambassador Dana and Anya Wright, who are both members of the Maine Climate Council. And I'm going to talk mostly briefly for my 10 minutes about the Maine's plan, Maine Won't Wait, because I think it's important to understand what our plan is and where we are going. And it's also great to be here with David Costello, who is an awesome climate leader and a good supporter of so many things that we are working on. So I'm just gonna try to share my screen, see if I can advance to the next slide. And of course it is frozen. All right, I'm gonna try again. the good news is the internet is on, state of Maine. All right, there we go. So I'm going to talk about our plan, Maine Won't Wait, Maine's 4-year action plan for climate. I'm not going to go into the details of climate change impacts on Maine, but I would highly encourage you to check out our website, climatecouncil.maine.gov. Sorry, that's again, climatecouncil.maine.gov, where you can read Maine's 4-year climate action plan, as well as a really impressive overview of the impacts climate is having on Maine. Again, this is an audience where I think you understand that climate is at our shores, on our doorsteps. It is certainly impacting our farmers, our industries, and our people, and it is now time to talk about action. So I work for Governor Janet Mills, and she has made taking action on climate and showing leadership one of her top issues since she took office in 2019, passing the law to create the Maine Climate Council, signing into law one of the most aggressive renewable portfolio standards in the country, requiring 80% of our energy on the electricity grid to be renewable by 2030 and 100% by 2050. I think we're going to beat that by a lot. She's passed laws to increase the number of efficient heat pumps in Maine, to start installing electric charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. We joined the U.S. Climate Alliance, a bipartisan coalition of 25 states committed to meeting the Paris climate goals, which obviously the exciting news is that the U.S. is back in. She's focused on ensuring that we are focused on offshore wind. We are not in favor of drilling off the coast of Maine, and doing lots of other things to encourage reducing our emissions right off the bat. So obviously the big thing we're going to talk about tonight is Maine's climate goals. So we passed a law again in 2019 to create the Maine Climate Council. It also, most importantly, established in law the reduction in Maine's greenhouse gas emissions now required in law, 45% reductions by 2030 and at least 80% by 2050. The governor announced actually before the United Nations in September of 2019 that Maine would be carbon neutral by 2045. In addition, our climate plan is really about how do we advance equity through Maine's climate response? How do we ensure Maine people, industries, and communities are resilient to the impacts of climate change? And how do we create economic opportunity for Maine people while we respond? So to do all those things, we created a 4-year action plan and delivered it to the governor, to the Maine legislature, and to the Maine people on December 1 of last year. So where do Maine's emissions come from? This is really kind of an important starting point. So 54% of Maine's emissions come from our transportation sector. That is much higher than many other states, and it reflects the fact that we are a rural state. We drive a lot. We have fewer emissions in other sectors, so obviously transportation is a key area of focus. Nearly 30% come from our buildings, 19% from our homes, and 11% from our commercial buildings. 9% comes from industry, and 7% from our electricity grid. And that actually partially reflects the fact that Maine, along with most states on the eastern seaboard, have joined something called RGGI and have been taking action to reduce emissions in the electrical sector for many years. So where are we on trying to get to at least a 45% reduction by 2030? Right now, Maine is at about 17.5% below our 1990 levels. And obviously we have a ways to go for 80%, but we are at least in the downward trajectory, which is actually not the case for many other US states. So to try to achieve Maine's ambitious reduction goals, we passed a law that created a 39-member Maine Climate Council. It's an assembly of scientists, industry leaders, bipartisan local and state officials, as well as youth representatives, which Anya is, Ambassador Dana, who is our tribal representative, as well as many others. We started, and I think this is really important, and it reflects kind of the COVID times we're living as well. It is most important to listen to the science. So we started with our scientific and technical subcommittee, really telling us where are we with climate, and starting off with data and facts. Next, we convened 6 working groups with more than 230 volunteers, lots of stakeholders, to recommend strategies to the Maine Climate Council for action. We have a transportation working group, a buildings, infrastructure and housing, an energy working group, a community resilience planning, public health and emergency management group, coastal and marine, and natural and working lands. And importantly, we now have a group called the Equity Subcommittee that's actually co-chaired by Ambassador Malyan Dana, who you'll hear from, that really focuses on equity issues, making sure that as we implement this plan, we are thinking about both how to ensure that the benefits go to our most vulnerable populations, and we are having a positive impact for diverse communities. So again, we are focused very much on science. And again, I encourage you to go to our website, check out the scientific assessment, more than 300 pages, really impressive data about the impacts of climate in Maine, a cost benefit analysis and modeling, greenhouse gas modeling of the climate action plan, an equity assessment that we really look to really guide our results to ensure that equity was an important part of our goals, as well as a plan to strengthen Maine's clean energy economy. So the 4 main goals of the Maine Climate Action Plan: 1, to reduce Maine's greenhouse gas emissions; 2, to make Maine more resilient to the impacts of climate change; 3, to foster economic opportunity and prosperity; and lastly, to advance equity through Maine's climate response. So I'm going to quickly walk through, and I'm just checking my time to make sure I don't go on for too long. But Maine's climate plan has 8 major action strategies. The first 3 are about reducing our emissions in the transportation sector, in the building sector, and the energy sector. So number 1, you heard transportation was our leading cause of emissions. So how do we reduce our emissions? First, we're working on a plan to accelerate Maine's transition to electric vehicles. We know that electric and plug-in hybrid vehicles obviously have a much less emissions, especially when they're running on a clean grid. We want to increase fuel efficiency in all cars. We want to consider alternative fuels. And importantly, we also want to reduce vehicle miles traveled. That is a boring and technical term, but it really is, how do we make it so we have to drive less? How do we have land use planning models that allow people to live closer to where they work and go to school? That's about housing policy. How do we ensure Maine people have access to high-speed internet? And then how do we also vastly increase our investment in transit so that people don't have to rely on their own vehicle every time they need to get somewhere? Obviously, a huge challenge in Maine, especially in a large rural state. Next, we want to reduce emissions in our buildings. So we want to transition to cleaner heating and cooling systems, efficient appliances. You can see on the right, a highly efficient heat pump, a major focus area for the governor. We want to accelerate efficiency improvements in buildings. So we have a goal to double the pace of weatherization for Maine homes. Obviously, Maine has a very old housing stock that relies on oil very much to heat it. Through building codes, we want to advance the design and construction of new buildings. As part of that, we want to advance the use of climate-friendly building products. Obviously, that's a super exciting area for Maine, where we have wood products. We have exciting new companies creating wood fiber insulation. We are hoping to attract a CLT plant so we can use our Maine forest to build products that can reduce our emissions when we build buildings. Obviously, we also want to make sure that the government is leading by example. I've talked already a little bit about our plan to reduce emissions in the energy sector. Obviously, a grid that works and that is clean is our goal. Lots of important work to happen in this area to make that all viable. So next, I'm going to talk about the areas of both the economy and our community's resilience and carbon sequestration. So a major goal of the governor's is to grow our clean energy economy and also protect our natural resource industries we know are going to be impacted by climate. Our fishermen, our farmers, our foresters already seeing the impacts of climate change. Incredibly important to help them both diversify and protect their industries from climate impacts, and also to figure out how we can best grow our clean energy economy. We are already seeing growth in this sector, and we think this is a huge opportunity for Maine. We right now import about $4 billion into Maine every year for fossil fuels. Obviously, if we can produce those fuels in Maine, a huge benefit for Maine people and Maine jobs. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the 30,000 clean energy goal. I think it's exciting to see what's happening across the country. In the 5 years before 2020, national employment grew by about 6%. Clean energy employment grew by 10.5%. We know Maine has seen similar growth, but we are growing at the slowest pace of any New England state through 2019. So we hope the policies and the focus of the Climate Council can really help Maine see the same growth we're seeing in other states. Protecting Maine's environment and natural and working lands incredibly crucial. Maine is a state that is 90% forested. We are currently sequestering carbon for the entire region in a way that's important. It's important we can keep these forests and lands working while continuing to sequester carbon. So a major focus of the Climate Council is how do we keep our forests? How do we support farmers that are trying to increase their soil carbon sequestration techniques? Lots of opportunity here, but needs to have lots of good participation from Maine's heritage industries. This picture here on the right is a picture of the Deer Isle Stonington Causeway, one of probably the areas of the state most likely to be impacted by sea level rise. So how do we help our communities build healthy and resilient communities that are ready for sea level rise, that are ready for the economic changes that climate is likely to bring, a major part of our climate action plan. Obviously, a major part of communities is infrastructure, and we have already seen crumbling infrastructure because of climate impacts, increased weather events that are only likely to increase more in the future. So a focus on infrastructure, you're hearing a lot about this in Washington, but a major focus again of the climate action plan. So importantly for our state, making sure that we engage with Maine people and communities about climate impacts and programs, incredibly important. From our youth and our education system, to our businesses, to our schools and municipalities, making sure that this is a plan not about state government, but about all of us and what we can do is really the most important thing. And I'm sure we'll talk a lot more about that tonight. So I will just say, again, check out the plan, climatecouncil.maine.gov. We're on all the varying social media things. You can follow our activities. Again, this is a plan that we really, we hope is a plan for all of Maine, for all of the folks on this call, and obviously the million people out there in our state to engage in. So again, thank you. And again, please check out Maine Won't Wait. And I will pass it back to Charles.
So thank you so much, Hannah. I'd like to introduce Ambassador Molly and Dana. Molly and Dana is the first Penobscot Nation ambassador. As ambassador, Ms. Dana acts as a representative of the Penobscot Nation and a liaison for the nation at the local, state, and federal levels of government in order to educate and advocate for policy and laws that impact and protect the Penobscot Nation's sovereignty, culture, natural resources, and the general welfare of the people. Prior to serving as ambassador, Ms. Dana served as an elected member of the Penobscot Nation Tribal Council, was the Human Resources Director for the Penobscot Indian Nation Enterprises, and worked at the Penobscot Nation Cultural and Historic Preservation Department. Ambassador Dana graduated from the University of Maine at Orono with a degree in political science. So now I turn it over to Ambassador Dana.
Thank you so much, Charles, and thank you to the University of New England. It's great to see all of you, and to my other panelists, it's an honor to be among you. And I'm so happy to be here tonight. My name is Molly and Dana. I use she, her pronouns, and I am honored to serve as the ambassador for the Penobscot Nation. So thinking tonight about my perspective on this work in the climate crisis and how we meet this head on, I obviously bring with me my background as a tribal leader and tribal citizen. And I want to thank you all for the beautiful land acknowledgement at the beginning of this event. In the area now called Maine, there used to be upwards of 20 distinct tribal nations pre-contact. There are now 4 tribes and 5 tribal communities. So thinking about just the sheer loss that Indigenous people in Maine have suffered throughout the generations, I really am, I continue to be so thankful and fully aware that I stand on the shoulders of all of those people who sacrificed so much and lived through generations of oppression and trauma. And I never take it for granted that my voice is heard. I want to talk about the connection between climate and the tribal nations. And that connection, it isn't kind of just a straight one-way line or one topic we think about. It's really woven into the fabric of who we are. I think a lot of times we do climate work as this separate thing, and we kind of see it as a scientific or natural resources issue, and it truly is. But I think it needs to be in every facet of our society. We are all living on the only earth we will have. So we need to start thinking like tribal nations, like we always have, and see climate as a relative, a friend, something we care about, something that we all need to unite around and really take care of together. And I'm thinking about the connection between land and tribal nations and this discussion. And when we talk about the tribes in Maine, I don't think it's any secret that there has been a lot of tension through the years with the tribal nations and the state of Maine. And a lot of that tension goes back to 1980 and the Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act, which I won't get too far into because I know we have limited time tonight. But that act set up a lot of power struggles and jurisdictional issues between the tribes in the state of Maine. And tying it all back to our land acknowledgements that were given, to thinking about all of those lost tribes that used to call this their homeland, it all is very relative and connected. So, I'm very thankful to be serving on the Maine Climate Council, because I do think we have reached a point where there needs to be healing, there needs to be more trust, and we need to all be united around caring for Mother Earth. And I'm really happy to bring the tribal perspective. And I made a little, flow chart here about how tribal people think about the environment and the earth. And it's ancient wisdom to sustenance, to science, to commitment. And that is sort of a flow, but it's also a cycle. And those things are all very, very connected. So we have this ancestral knowledge that has passed down through the generations, that we know that the earth is central to our survival. At the Penobscot Nation, our ancestral territory is the Penobscot River, where we live, where I am right now. So it's not a question of if we need to take care of the water and if the water needs to be clean. It's a question of, how far will we go to protect it? And I think, as we've seen throughout our history, we will never stop protecting the clean air and the clean water, because it is how our ancestors lived, it's how we lived, and it's how we have survived through the unthinkable events of history. And I think sometimes when we think about tribal nations, we think of them as kind of a people in the past, or we think that this ancestral knowledge is, the stereotypical depictions of wigwams and teepees, and and we can get stuck up in those kind of images. But the tribal nations also have very sophisticated natural resources departments. Currently, we're doing some state-of-the-art work in our laboratories. We are constantly monitoring the air and the water. We have big game biologists. We have people studying the fish in the river. And I think it's important to stress the point that we are still here, and we are taking climate work very seriously, and we are very happy to be involved at every level. And thinking about those levels, I want to back up a little bit and talk about it can be a big relief to have leaders in charge that see the climate crisis for what it is, that don't deny it, and are willing to take bold steps to fix it. And something I'm really excited about right now is that Deb Haaland, the Laguna Pueblo tribal citizen and now Secretary of the Interior under President Biden, she was one of the first Indigenous women to be elected to Congress. It's hard to understate just how significant that is for tribal nations. The Department of the Interior houses the BIA and many different departments that deal with tribal nations and the environment. So we are all really thankful. And I think it goes deeper than that. I think we're feeling represented and seen in a way that we truly never have been before. So thinking about Native people and politics and climate, I think it really is all connected. And I'm really happy to, see that Governor Mills is making climate part of her priorities by establishing the Climate Council and fighting hard for the goals. And I'll get into a little bit later some areas where I think policy needs to be strengthened, and that is about tribal sovereignty for sure. Check on my time here. I should be about halfway done. So, I've talked a little bit about how we have survived and what the tribes bring to this climate work. I also want to talk about how to involve tribal nations in this work. And I think this is kind of across the board for marginalized people, for these vulnerable communities, for a lot of these frontline communities that might be feeling the effects of climate change the most directly and may not even realize it, or don't have the resources or the capabilities to get involved. I think a lot of people are working very hard just to survive and provide for their families. So working on climate initiatives or anything extra feels like a luxury. So part of my work currently, as Hannah Pingree pointed out, is being a co-chair of the Climate Council Subcommittee on Equity. And we're really taking a deep dive into how to reach these communities in our state, how to approach climate with an equity, or climate work with an equity lens, and thinking about things like heat pumps and sea level rise and emissions and carbon sequestration and all of these goals in the climate plan, and how that affects Mainers from communities that we don't always hear from. So we've had a couple of meetings of that group so far, and there's been a real sharp focus on environmental justice and defining that and thinking about what that means as we approach each of the Climate Council recommendations so that we can provide our recommendations at a later date in our process. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, but I think there's a lot to be hopeful about. And when it comes to the tribes, as I mentioned earlier, I think for us, part of Maine doing better with climate work is acknowledging tribal sovereignty. In 1980, when the tribes signed the Maine Indian Land Claims Settlement Act, we never signed away our rights as sovereign tribal nations. And I think right now, with the current efforts underway in the legislature to amend that act, we are looking for fairness and equity. And I think that there's a lot of fear around that. There's a lot of fear of the unknown. But if we can really take a deep dive into what all of that means, and we can see that the sky won't fall if tribes are, acknowledged for the jurisdictional powers that we should have had all along, I truly believe that it serves to benefit everyone in Maine. And I think in equity work, we talk a lot about when you hold up your most vulnerable communities, you're lifting the entire state. And with these efforts in the legislature to restore a lot of the rights to tribes, that doesn't only benefit the tribes, it benefits the environment for sure. Acknowledging that ancestral stewardship and current commitments to these lands and waters, and it really truly benefits Maine. And I think it's a big step in that healing that we need to start doing together. So I think that's about all that I have prepared, and I'm really happy to see some questions coming into the chat, and I'm looking forward to the full panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Dana. We now turn to Anya Wright. Anya is the grassroots climate action organizer for Sierra Club Maine and the youth representative to the Maine Climate Council. While serving on the Maine Climate Council, Ms. Wright organized opportunities for youth to mobilize, network, and aid in the policy process. A recent graduate from the College of the Atlantic, she has been extensively involved in climate just activism in the state of Maine and has attended international climate summits in support of the Paris Climate Accord. Ms. Wright is a founding member of Maine Youth for Climate Justice and the Down East Climate Emergency Action Coalition. She sits on the board of the Maine Climate Action Now, and co-authored the Climate Justice Syllabus. So I turn it over to Ms. Wright.
Thank you so much.
It's such an honor to be here, and I just want to shout out all of my other panelists. It's an honor to be on a panel with Ambassador Dana and Director Pingree and David Costello. There are three folks that I look up to a lot in the Maine climate community, and who I look for guidance quite often. And definitely as a young person in this space, it's a real gift to have such amazing leaders in this space to work with and learn from. So jumping right in, when I was first approached about this panel, I got very overwhelmed by the question of how do we solve climate change by 2030 and what are the most important solutions? This is a really tricky question to answer. Part of solving climate change is definitely through the work of the Climate Council that Director Pingree talked about, through legislative and bond efforts to get at the different, slices of the pie of our emissions. And these are necessary actions that will lead us to our technical goals of reducing emissions. But when I think about the most powerful solutions to the climate crisis, I think mostly about system change and climate justice. And I know Ambassador Dana just talked about, the term environmental justice and how we're working on the equity subcommittee to come up with a definition. But I thought I'd share one here with you all now. I know there are many different definitions out there, but climate justice to me is the recognition that the climate crisis was caused by failures of our political, social, and economic systems. And solving it demands intersectional solutions that will transform these systems and hold those responsible for the climate crisis accountable, and ultimately resulting in a livable future where all can thrive. So in sum, working for climate justice means solving the climate crisis by solving systemic problems in our society, like racism, sexism, colonialism, patriarchy, etc., all the isms. And so when we look back through our history, it becomes really clear that systemic issues are at the root of the climate crisis. For example, our profit and growth-oriented systems of extraction, production, and consumption sacrifice the needs of the many and the well-being of the planet for the interests of a few. Unequal and exploitative economic and social structures rooted in colonialism and patriarchy abuse nature and extend inequality across countries, classes, gender, race, and communities. Policies and practices promoted by global corporations and rich industrial countries like the US, international institutions, and economic and political elites perpetuate and foster these systems. So most individuals and communities, most individuals and communities bear little responsibility for the crisis, yet suffer its worst effects, and many are deprived of the means to respond in an effective way. And folks bear additional impacts of false solutions promoted by those who avoid meaningful action, but instead seek to profit from the crisis. So all of these system failures are inhibiting solving the climate crisis on a global, national, statewide, and community level. Climate change already multiplies sufferings of people globally who are burdened by hunger, dispossession, and human rights violations. Often folks refer to the climate crisis as a catastrophe multiplier, so creating more crises for marginalized folks who are already suffering from other crises. So for example, think of a summer day in July in Maine in 2030. Think about who has access to air conditioning, who can afford the extra cost on their electric bill to run an air conditioner all day, who can afford to go to the hospital if they experience a heat stroke, and who is at the highest risk for heat-induced illness. So even with climate action pledged by governments, including Maine's pledges and the United States, we're still at a risk for catastrophic climate change that will radically change the planet, collapse systems that we rely on for life. And it also threatens to wipe out populations and profoundly change life on Earth as we know it. But no matter the ultimate outcome, if we want to have the best chance for survival for our future generations and for our current generations, the crisis requires a response centered on human rights, equity, justice, and system change. And addressing these challenges calls for profound transformation at all levels, local, national, and global. The transformation includes rapid, just transition of energy systems, modes of production, and consumption practices that are more compatible with the limits of the planet, and solutions that are aimed at meeting people's needs, not relentlessly pursuit of profit. And to achieve these changes, we need to overcome the refusal by wealthy elites and corporations and governments to meet their responsibilities and their opposition to social change. So I know that was kind of policy wonky a little bit. So, and it's almost easier to think about these system changes at a global level or a national level. It's easier to see quite obviously who's left out of conversations at UN climate negotiations or conversations at the White House. But what does system change look like at the state level, and what can we do in Maine? So I want to focus the rest of my time on what it looks like to shift power in Maine in order to achieve climate solutions by 2030. So when I think about the environmental movement in Maine and the Maine government in general, I think of a primarily white, primarily wealthy, and in the case of the environmental movement, primarily Southern Maine constituency. But when we look at Maine as a whole, that doesn't reflect all demographics. And these spaces do not adequately represent or reflect the communities in Maine who are at the front lines of the climate crisis. So as a little example, in Maine, I've been thinking a lot about this with the natural gas industry. So as you may know, natural gas company proposed a gas line going through mid-coast Maine earlier this year. And natural or fracked gas has been advertised as a bridge fuel, as something that is less expensive and has less emissions than oil. And the project in the Mid-Coast was supported by large local businesses and by town councils of Belfast because they really saw dollar signs with the project, a project that would stimulate the local economy, lower gas prices, and provide a few jobs. The natural gas company was offering a refund of up to $3,000 for those who joined the project. And at the end of the day, natural gas is certainly not a climate-friendly solution. It's not even the cheapest heating option. It costs $2,000 per year to heat the average home using fracked gas, while a heat pump powered by solar costs only $1,000 per year. Furthermore, jobs in the fossil fuel industry are declining. And job creation as a result of the project would have been temporary. And meanwhile, renewable energy jobs offer more long-term security and are the fastest growing occupation in the US, as Director Pingree mentioned in her talk. And so as the fracked gas industry continues to decline, consumers would be left with a useless stranded asset and would eventually have to upgrade their systems again to run on electricity. But still, the project was given a real chance. And thank goodness it was canceled due to grassroots organizing and an outpouring of community action and over 200 people showing up for a community meeting asking for this project not to go forward. But when we think about systems, why did this gas line even have a chance to begin with? Why are we continuing to let the profit of companies be a factor in the future of our state? And why are people and their futures not automatically put first? So in order to solve the climate crisis, what I'm getting at is that we need to invest, instead of investing in companies like the fossil fuel industry and continuing to give them the benefit of the doubt, we need to invest in our communities and to create an economic system where people are always put first. And so the environmental movement in Maine and the Maine government have not historically always given adequate power to those most vulnerable to climate change. But we are working towards it, and it's imperative that we continue. It starts with things like having an equity subcommittee for the Maine Climate Council, or in your local organization or in your personal organization, providing stipends for folks who need it for their time to participate in a project. But what would it look like for power to truly be shifted in Maine from our primarily white, older, wealthy legislature and well-paid, primarily white environmental organizations that primarily serve Southern Maine to a system that actually represents and uplifts those who don't historically hold power or who don't have access to power. So in 2030, political power in Maine, to me, makes me dream of a state where young folks have a say in what the state does, where you don't have to be retired to run for office or to have the time to volunteer for an organization. I think of a world where rural Mainers feel just as represented by the environmental movement in Maine as urban and Southern Mainers, and where tribal sovereignty is respected and uplifted. And so I know I'm running short on time, so I'll wrap up, but I encourage all of those, all folks in the room who are representing these primarily represented groups, older folks, wealthy folks, white folks, ask you, what can you do to shift power, and what work do you need to do to ensure that your voice is not valued above others who do not share your identity, even if you think your opinion is important. And so I'll leave it at that, but I want to leave you all with a challenge to get involved in your immediate community, but whether it be with your local municipal government or with a statewide group like Sierra Club Maine or Natural Resources Council of Maine, and with a challenge to do a deeper dive into your role in these broken systems and to think about how to make climate justice a reality in the state of Maine. With that, I'll pass it back to our moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anya. I'm really excited to get to the questions because you've brought up so many interesting things. I can't wait to hear some of your thoughts on some of the questions that are out there. Our last panelist is David Costello. David is the Climate and Clean Energy Director for the Natural Resources Council of Maine and has more than 25 years of senior level government management and policy experience. Prior to his present position, Mr. Costello directed 2 non-governmental climate change projects in Maryland and served as Deputy Secretary of the Maryland Department of the Environment. He has served as the Director of the Maryland Governor's Delivery Unit, the Director of Maryland's Office of Smart Growth, the Director of the Mayor's Office of Community Investment in Baltimore City, and a Regional and Country Program Manager with the United States Agency for International Development. Mr. Costello attended the University of Maine and is a graduate of the George Washington University in the London School of Economics. So I turn it over to David Costello.
Thank you, Charles, and I want to thank the University of New England for putting on this wonderful program. I also am honored to serve, and want to give a shout out to my colleagues, Hannah, Mullion, and Anya. They've done tremendous work, as Hannah outlined, in putting together a nation-leading and excellent climate action and thoughtful climate action plan, as well as a compelling climate action plan. What I want to focus on is again, I guess I'll outline by saying what a challenge it is, obviously, to address this climate crisis that we're confronting today. I'm sure many of you have heard there's an intergovernmental panel of climate scientists that have been working for some time now, trying to devise plans, understanding the impacts and what we need to do, as well as trying to convey what we need to do to address climate change. And just to provide a little context, they've most recently said if we're to get on track to addressing the worst impacts of climate change by 2030, we have to reduce global emissions by 45%. What that means is developed states and nations need to do a lot more, and that's at least 70%. And that's only to get on track to again, avoid the worst impacts and costs and risks of climate change. But also, they talk about we need to zero out. We need to zero out emissions by 2050, and we need to look at carbon drawdown post 2050. That's literally drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. One thing I certainly want to commend again the governor, what Governor Mills has done in establishing the council and the work that the council has done. And I look forward to the governor during her second term. It's great that she's established a carbon neutrality goal by 2045. And I look forward to Maine being the first carbon negative state after 2050. The way I want to frame the discussion going on is there are no magic bullets to combat or to address climate change, but there are a range of solutions, and we have the means today if we can marshal the political will to implement these solutions. And what I'll do is I'll frame the solutions in sort of two approaches. One is pricing carbon and greenhouse gas emissions and taking those resources and investing them in a range of solutions, many of which Hannah and Anya and Mulligan have touched upon somewhat. And also the second approach is enacting progressively stricter and enforceable regulations and standards. Bethany, if you could put up the first slide, that would be helpful. Looking at carbon pricing, I think many of you have probably heard that the vast majority of scientists and economists around the globe have said the most effective way to advance climate action and to address climate change most effectively soonest is actually to put a price on carbon. Director Pingree mentioned the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is an approach, it's a cap and invest program that is an approach to pricing carbon. And what it does is it places a cap on emissions from large power plants and forces those power plants to buy allowances, permits to basically pollute. And that money that is raised is put into a range of programs. The most effective, I'll talk, at least to date, and the most cost-effective is energy efficiency efforts. This is something that all Mainers understand. We've got, obviously we need to weatherize our homes. We've got heating challenges in the winter. To the extent that we weatherize and put a lot more money into weatherization and make the investments to drive weatherization, not only are we going to decrease our consumption of energy, but obviously we're going to reduce the cost of energy for many of these homes. So this is extremely effective, been the most cost-effective approach in the United States to date. And these efficiencies standards apply to transportation, which I'll talk about in a minute as well. But also, as Director Pingree has talked about, we want to advance other energy efficiency systems in the home. And that would include heat pumps. The governor's established an excellent goal for 2025 of 100,000 heat pumps installed in Maine. And Anya's mentioned the value of heat pumps in terms of savings to homes in Maine. Others things that we need to look at and again, saving costs as well as driving down, greenhouse gas emissions are the appliances, looking to purchase Energy Star and increasing, basically the rebates and the programs that would help to incent the use of more efficient appliances and products. Second, we need to invest more in clean energy generation and distribution. Even though the energy, the power sector in Maine is only 9% of our emissions, we need to really spur beneficial electrification across our transportation sector and our building sector. And the way to do that, and as Director Pingree mentioned, Maine is sending over $4 billion out of state for energy. Much of it, the majority of which is for fossil fuel natural gas consumption and combustion. If we can bring all of that money back and build out our solar, wind, energy storage and other things like green hydrogen. I mean, green hydrogen is actually something that's promising. It may be a decade away, but it's something that's going to address some of the harder areas to address climate change, like industry, maritime, maritime vessels, long haul trucks, and provide even greater storage if it's clean. And what I mean by that is, to the extent that we build out solar, and just to throw you one interesting fact about solar, in one year's worth of solar on the planet can take care of all of our energy needs across the globe for 7,000 or 8,000 years. So of course, solar is something that will help to dominate, but obviously wind is important, and Hannah's done a great job talking about the offshore wind opportunities for Maine. And all of this will drive even more jobs. Energy efficiency will drive the most, and clean energy generation, distribution, and the building out of our grid, modernizing our grid to accommodate will accomplish much of this as well. Next slide, please. And I think it's coming. Here we are. Transportation. Hannah mentioned that the transportation sector is Maine's greatest challenge, and quite frankly, It's the biggest challenge across the country. 54% of our emissions. The state's doing a great job in identifying what we need to do. For instance, how many zero emitting vehicles we need to deploy by 2025, for instance. It's about 40,000. By 2030, to meet our targets, it's close to 200,000. These are heavy lifts. And of course, we're going to need to do a lot more to make sure that we put in place the incentives. We're going to have some federal assistance. No state, for instance, can achieve these important and ambitious climate goals without the federal government stepping up. And it's great to see the Biden administration is really willing to invest a great deal in this effort, and it's certainly needed. And it's again, as I said, no state and nation can achieve what we need to achieve without the United States really stepping up. Other things on transportation, as Hannah's touched upon, to the extent that we can build up public transportation. As you know, Maine's a rural state. It's a state with a lot of elderly people that need public transportation to get around. So mobility is extremely important. It's something the state is looking at. Broadband expansion, telework. A lot of people are studying and working from home. This is reducing vehicle miles traveled and emissions. Bicycle and pedestrian ways. This is something that we'll want to invest more in the coming years with both state and federal money. And of course, smart growth. To the extent that we build more livable, walkable communities, villages throughout Maine that have the amenities that attract more people, attract more jobs, and quite frankly, improve the health and well-being of everyone in the community, as well as reduce the environmental impacts of the community residents. Last thing I would say in terms of this section here, in terms of carbon and GHG emission pricing and using the investments, is carbon sequestration. Right now, globally, the atmosphere is saturated. And even the oceans are saturated with carbon. So there isn't a lot of space there to take up carbon in a way that it would reduce the impacts of climate change. Soils, our soils globally is really the most opportune area where it's not saturated. So regenerative agriculture and forestry programs, more sustainable forestry, where, not only as, again, Director Pingree talked about embodied carbon in wood products like insulation and mass timber, across laminated timber, and selling that and making a lot more money for Maine, for instance. But also in stocking and more sustainably managing our forests at the same time, so that we increase the stocking of the forests and bring the carbon into the soils. And if we do this right, if we do this regionally and nationally, Maine can make a lot of money, because we're likely to see programs develop where other states and the private sector, quite frankly, invest in carbon sequestration to gain credit to address the carbon emissions that they've accumulated. The other things I would say is that there is likely to be advanced carbon capture at some point. And of course, this is likely to take time. And a lot of people are spending a lot of money on this. Again, these are technologies that might be 20 years away. But as I mentioned earlier, our biggest challenge post-2050 will be carbon drawdown. And we're going to need a lot of sequestration then to address all of the carbon that will be in the atmosphere. Next slide, please. And so I'll shift now to quite frankly, the cheapest way. At least it's politically obviously challenging, as everything else I've mentioned is politically challenging, is that if we were to enact stricter regulations covering carbon, methane, hydrofluorocarbons, and other air pollutants, air emissions that add to our greenhouse gas problem, our global warming challenge. And we need to do this. This is taking place, but it's taking place awfully slowly. But you can imagine, to the extent that we do put in place appliance standards and product standards that reduce the impact of those products, for instance, being produced. As you can imagine, there's a lot of carbon emitted in the production of a lot of products across the globe. Just to give you an example, I'll pick out buildings as well. Commercial buildings are mostly built with cement, steel, aluminum, and glass. It would be great if much of this were, if they were starting to build out as homes are. Homes are predominantly built with wood products. To the extent that we can, alter the build out of these large commercial and buildings and use more wood product, embodied carbon. And again, we'd want to make sure it was done sustainably though, because we want to increase the stocking in our forests at the same time that we're putting embodied carbon and wood into our buildings. That's just one example. I mentioned appliances earlier about more efficient appliances that use less energy, cost less money in the long run to operate. And that's related to the other thing on the code side is building codes. Right now, we have building codes that are being improved. We initially, before Governor Mills, Maine was in line with the 2009 codes. Now we're moving to 2015 as a benchmark and developing what are called stretch codes so that conceivably the state could have new construction codes, building codes that zero out emissions by 2035. That's an extremely ambitious goal, but it's certainly a target that the state is aiming to achieve. One other thing I'd say about some of the targets, if you look at what the state has done in their climate action plan, they've also established targets for doubling the number of homes weatherized by 2030. It's great to see that the governor has established a clean energy sort of a target for clean energy, clean economy job increases, doubling those by 2030. So there's some great targets in the plan. As I said, and I guess what I'll end with is just to stress the challenges here. We understand what we need to do. We can even model. Oh, I'm sorry, I've got another slide. Could you go one more slide, please? Thanks. This is what I want to get at, because it really when we're talking about the political will, accountability is important. I love the phrase that what gets measured gets done. And it's important to know what our targets are, to what extent a particular program needs to be implemented and by when. And that's why it's important for Maine. And I know the governor's office is taking a look at things like progress indicators and performance benchmarks. I think that's extremely important. That should be applied across the board for all of the programs and actions that ultimately become part of Maine's climate action plan, and to the extent that we measure and we routinely measure and we transparently measure and track progress. And on an ongoing basis, and I know the Climate Council is intending to do this, to not only track, but to assess and to report out to the public on the state's progress. I think that's extremely important. And again, I know that the state is looking to do that. The other thing is, and this has been touched upon very well by all of my colleagues, it's basically ensuring across the board equity provisions. As we identify all of these actions and programs, there needs to be an equity lens. We need to make sure that our most vulnerable and impacted residents and communities are being addressed. And of course, if we do this, then we're addressing the larger problem. For instance, if we're providing weatherization assistance, let's make sure that we're doing it at the low and moderate income homes, the homes of the elderly, which have high energy bills. Because what we're often doing is we're providing heating assistance to help cover those bills in many instances. If we coordinate in the way and we make sure that we're investing much of our public dollars in a way that bring down those high costs, then they also bring down the costs of what government has to spend to address those high bills. But that's just one example. I think it's good to see that Maine has established a subcommittee for the Climate Council. I think they'll make sure that there's an equity lens applied to each of the programs that the state ultimately is basically implementing and forwarding or advancing. But ultimately, if we do this, and I'm an optimist, I think we will do this as we marshal enough civic support. And of course, as Anya said with such passion, is that it's really about the young people getting involved and getting very involved. civically, across the state, at all levels of government, letting elected officials know exactly what needs to be done, again, by when, if we're going to address these challenges, with the understanding that as we do, we're not only going to improve the health of our environment, we're going to improve public health, because we're going to eliminate this, considerable air pollution that's still not so much in Maine as it is in other states, but it's here as well in certain communities, given the particulate matter from diesel engines, for instance. But also there'll be tremendous economic benefits. This clean energy transition is going to generate significant jobs in Maine. And why don't I stop there? And I look forward to the questions and discussions with the rest of the panel.
So thank you, David, and thank you to all of our panelists here today for sharing your expertise. We now encourage questions and comments from the audience. I say encourage, we've got tons of them already. For viewers from Zoom or Facebook Live, please type your questions, stories, or reactions using the chat function. We want to hear your perspectives, thoughts, and questions on these urgent issues as current and future leaders and as engaged citizens of our community and world. And I will start now, and I will apologize because we are not going to get to all of the questions that have come through the chat and the Q&A that all four of you have managed to bring out in our audience. So time is short, so I'm just going to dive in and ask the panel as a whole these different questions, and whoever would like to talk, please just start talking. I'm going to start with one. A lot of the audience here are college students. So my first question to you four is, what do you think the education system should do for the younger generations in order for them to be educated in climate change and focus on the evidence instead of the politics?
I mean, Charles, I think your question started to answer it. I mean, I think that obviously a focus on data and science and facts makes solutions pretty clear. I think the education system, we heard this in some of the intros, obviously can play a crucial role. I think, folks like Anya, who are really major climate leaders in the state, lots of youth activists in school, I would say we hear all the time from elementary and middle school students. So students are passionate. They want to know more. They want to know what can they do. And frankly, everything from physics to marine science to sort of climate change facts. I think it's important to be educated about climate. It's important that lots of young people understand the science and how they can engage in it. And obviously, a lot of climate action is going to come through policy levers. So clearly, civics, our government system, how does this happen at the local level, to our state government, to what the United Nations is doing. So I think we have in our Maine climate plan that education is important. It's important in terms of what are our curriculums in schools, but clearly it's incredibly important at higher levels where students are really gonna, we need engineers, we need heat pump installers, we need electricians. So there's a really practical issue with climate in that there are thousands of jobs, even in Maine, that need to be filled with people who can be employed in climate oriented jobs. So it's a pretty wide spectrum. I would say the focus of higher education, especially on climate, is helpful. Maine's research institutions have been crucial to our understanding of climate science in Maine. So, that needs to continue. And again, I will maybe hand it off to Anya because I think she's been a really good advocate for these issues in the Maine Climate Council.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you, Director Pingree. This is a question that I think about a lot. I think, Director Pingree mentioned a couple of things that I wanted to mention, but I think, just piggybacking off of the work of the Climate Council, and certainly education is a part of the Climate Action Plan. I know I graduated from Falmouth High School in 2015, right outside of Portland. And I barely learned about climate change in high school. And I, took quite a few science classes and was definitely searching for education on climate change. And I think so definitely, updating our curriculum is a huge piece, and I think, things have already changed since I graduated high school as well. But I think also there's a culture around climate change that is really complicated. I've had conversations with high school teachers who are afraid to talk about climate change in the classroom because it's seen as a political issue. So definitely getting to what Director Pingree was talking about in terms of really effectively communicating the science to folks, I think is really important. And then, I think for the young folks in the room and the college folks in the room, doing what this program is all about, like asking your teachers to talk about climate change in the classroom is really important. I think climate change is such an interdisciplinary issue that is relevant to all areas of study. And then I think too, getting involved with other young folks in the state of Maine that are working on climate action is a great way to, make your voice heard in the state of Maine. I think, testifying on bills as a young person is always effective. Legislators love to hear from young people. There are some great groups that I can put some links to in the chat, such as Maine Youth for Climate Justice or Maine Environmental Changemakers, that are youth-led groups working on climate action in the state. So there's definitely a lot of opportunities to get involved. And I think, at the end of the day, just keep advocating for what you want to see and what you want to learn about. And
I'll just add real quickly, I probably am the last one to answer this because I went to high school with Molly's dad in Old Town. But let me just say this is what's going to happen over the next decade and a half. Climate change is going to become such a real impending, well, not pending, it's already here, problem that I think young people are going to mobilize in ways that we haven't seen yet, because it's their future. I mean, and I think that we, to the extent that young people have mobilized in the past, we've yet to see young people mobilize to the extent they'll mobilize by 2030, when they realize that, quite frankly, the globe, the countries and the politicians aren't doing enough to address climate change, particularly when we have the means, the knowledge to do it. We just lack the political will. And I think that alone will drive young people to really mobilize and advance change.
Thanks. I'd like to pivot just a tiny bit, because what Anya and David, what you just talked about is that I think that there is a generational difference in this. I think the young people, they know about this. A couple of people put in the chat, what if some people don't believe in climate change and make more climate problems for other people? In other words, how should we, or how can we deal with climate deniers, and maybe the intergenerational conflict that we have here? How can this next generation deal with the fact that it might not just be inertia, it may be some people denying the existence of it?
Anya, well, I guess I can just jump in. There are always going to be deniers. I mean, I trust there's still people who believe the Earth is flat. But anyway, it's a small percentage, and if you look at polling, those that outright deny climate change is occurring. It's getting smaller and smaller every time we hear more about monstrous wildfires, storms, droughts, these kinds of things. So I think over time, the good news is that people are going to change their attitude slowly, but the vast majority of people in the United States, and certainly in Maine, want more climate action. They understand that the climate change is real, that it's harmful, it's happening now. And so I'm optimistic that the battle isn't so much with the public, it's with the politicians, because often it's tough. I mean, many of these solutions, at least initially, even though they'll drive significant benefits, economic, health, and environmental benefits, it's really tough in the near term. to take a lot of these steps. And even though the public supports climate action and more ambitious climate action, when they see what it might cost in the near term, it's their attitudes change a bit. But the good news again is that I think overall the attitudes are heading in the right direction, and that we'll always have deniers, and we just have to show them in time that their fears, their concerns were unwarranted, and that will just take time.
And I would just add that, I mean, I think the thing is that, you know, climate issues are incredibly important to many of us. But we also need to think about how to approach people who are living busy lives and they've got other things going on. And, you know, our finger wagging is not going to help. So we have to meet people where they are. And so, you know, a lot of climate solutions are about creating good paying jobs, about improving public health in their communities. You know, weatherization, it saves you money. Most people like to save money. Things like heat pumps are new technologies that work better and are more comfortable. So, you know, EVs are very foreign to people, but I think, you know, as we see the next 5-10 years progress, they're going to be cool cars that people are going to want to drive. You know, I live in a small offshore island community, and, you know, how do I convince my fellow fishermen, you know, in my community to drive big trucks, that an EV truck is cool? Well, when a Ford F-150 comes out and the acceleration is much faster and they can plug it in at home and they don't have to buy gas, it may be cool. So I mean, I think that there is, you know, we are going to go through a period of immense change. There are certainly hard things. We certainly have a feeling in our state of a lot of things, you know, we don't like to look at them, and that's something we have to figure out how to manage with climate, because these solutions require solar panels and wind turbines and, you know, transmission lines. But I think the reality is there are a lot of benefits for people. And again, you know, whether you're a fisherman or a farmer or you live in Maine, you're seeing changes in the climate. Most people don't deny it. They might feel uncomfortable with some of the solutions, but a lot of the solutions have real co-benefits, and selling those benefits is important.
Yeah, I think that in my work, I certainly run into a lot of people that don't agree with me and don't see the need for a lot of the things I've worked on or the things I speak out about, because it doesn't affect them at all. And I think a lot of people see climate as something that's not affecting them because maybe they don't realize that it is, or they're not kind of thinking about the next generations. And I think, you know, it's a great point to think about meeting people where they're at. And that, like I spoke about earlier, that working on things like this and sitting around having these discussions is a luxury for some people that other people can't even think about because they're trying to get through the day to day. And I think in my work where I've been able to connect with people that really don't agree with me is talking about kind of shared humanity. You know, human beings, all of us are driven by a few very basic things. We want to feel safe. We want to be fed, we want to be sheltered. So tying in some of these facts we're talking about and some real human experiences and being relatable and talking about equity and making lives easier so that we can come together and talk about climate, I think it's all part of a very large picture. And I do agree about, you know, there may not be a lot of deniers. There's a lot of people that this is uncomfortable, like Director Pingree said. So I wholeheartedly agree.
Yeah, Ambassador Dana, I think you really hit the nail on the head with that one. I think, you know, what I talk about a lot with folks who ask me this question is, yeah, really meeting people where they're at and, you know, recognizing that everybody has some struggle that they're dealing with. Everybody loves something. And those are things that we can connect with folks on. And I think, you know, Maine is a really special place where a lot of folks, regardless of their political leanings or their beliefs, you know, they really care about recreation, or they really care about the outdoors. They really care about things that are very obviously connected to the climate crisis. And so I think, you know, that's a good starting off point with folks that are, you know, climate change deniers or whatever you want to call them. And I think, you know, another part is that, you know, the fossil fuel industry ran a very successful misinformation campaign for decades on the fact that climate change isn't, you know, not on the fact, on the idea that climate change is not real. And so I think there's still a lot of misinformation out there. And so I think, demonizing folks that were affected by that misinformation is not always the way to go. And I think, giving folks the benefit of the doubt, because at the end of the day, they probably do want a better world for their children. So.
Okay, let me go in a little bit of a different direction. I apologize for I'm jumping all over because I want to get a little taste of what all the people are asking. So here's one from an educator. Indigenous peoples are about 5% of the world's population, but they live in and are stewards of 80% of the world's biodiversity. So preserving indigenous cultural heritages and preserving biodiversity go hand in hand. So as an educator, this person is interested in what the state is doing or can do to incorporate Maine's indigenous stewardship traditions into environmental education in Maine.
Well, that's a loaded question. And I think there's a lot of answers. From an educational standpoint, we've passed a law in Maine that a lot of people don't know about in 2001 that actually requires the teaching of Wabanaki studies in public schools. And that was passed by my great aunt, Donna Loring, when she was a tribal representative for Penobscot Nation. And I think when that law is fully supported, which I hope it will be soon, we actually have a task force and a commission working on ways to develop this curriculum and really get it into schools. I think that will go a long way into kind of bringing about a lot more awareness in the youth and the students and the children in the state of Maine. And I think that's a great starting point. As far as kind of the ancestral knowledge and stewardship, I think the way to do that is to keep having Indigenous people at the table. And if you can't find us, you can find people that know us and you can push until you really hear from us. And I think that's what's been so great about the past couple of years. We've been able to get tribal sovereignty really highlighted in a lot of ways throughout the state. And I think that's showing. And I'll go back and plug this legislation again that seeks to amend that 1980 Land Claim Settlement Act that really will, one area is natural resources and those kind of jurisdictional issues about the tribes. And I think the tribes are a great model, our natural resources departments and our experts, and we all have that kind of woven into our work, that knowledge about stewardship. And I think something important to think about with the tribes is that this has been our homeland since time immemorial. We are never leaving our homeland. So it's really in our best interest to take the best care of it that we can. And we never think about land as an ownership thing. It's all about connection and stewardship. So I think, from a mechanical standpoint, getting these voices heard in every level of government and society and culture, and fully supporting that law that makes our students aware of the Wabanaki nations in Maine, not just historically, but in the present.
Ambassador Dana said it very well. We're not going to, she's an incredible leader and we are very lucky to have her. So I wouldn't add anything to that.
Fantastic. So we have a bunch of scientists in the audience too. And this one comes from one of the scientists. It says, hydroelectricity is carbon neutral, but terrible for fish watersheds in the ocean. What are the panelists' positions on keeping or removing hydroelectric and other dams in Maine?
I mean, I can speak from the, I am not an expert in dam removals, but I would actually, and I know David actually works for an organization that's worked on some of these projects, but our Inland Fisheries and Wildlife Department, as well as our Department of Marine Resources, has been actually pretty active in a number of dam restoration projects where they are preventing fish passage. There's been a number of exciting removal projects. And frankly, a lot of the dams in Maine are very small. They're not producing significant amount of renewable power, and they are impeding wildlife. So I would say it's an issue that again, I couldn't tell you the full scope, but I was shocked to hear the other day how many dams there are in Maine, and there are thousands. A lot of them are not electricity producing, but they are impacting wildlife. I mean, I think The issues of big hydro obviously are playing out in Maine. Maine has, a moderate number of hydro projects that are producing electricity currently on our grid, but it's not where we see growth. I mean, the opportunity in Maine is really in solar, in wind, in new technologies like battery storage, green hydrogen, which David mentioned, which is really creating hydrogen with renewable energy sources. It's still expensive now, but we see it coming down. So I think dams are a thing of the past, and the future is in a lot of innovation that's happening, and we're seeing it in Maine, and it's producing reliable power on our grid, which is great news.
Yeah, and I would just say I agree with what Hannah said, and I did grow up along the Penobscot River, and so I'm very excited to see now that a number of dams that were close to where I grew up or have been eliminated, been removed, and it's made a big difference. I remember as a kid, going down to the Vesey Dam and seeing Atlantic salmon. It was very rare then, and that's years ago. I won't date myself. I'm not that old, but anyway. But what Hannah said is absolutely right. The transition, we do need to remove these dams. It really is impacting wildlife in Maine, and of course, fishing. And to the extent that these rivers, put more salmon and other fish out into the ocean, then that obviously is great for fishing, both in, riverine fishing as well as ocean fishing. It's extremely important. It is a transition that will take place. It'll take a number of years, but the sooner that Maine removes the dams, and there's a number of ideas on the Kennebec right now to remove some of those dams, which I think is extremely important. And hopefully that'll happen soon as we get these wonderful rivers again flowing freely. And again, obviously what Hannah said about wind, solar, storage, green hydrogen, and conceivably other technologies that we've yet to commercialize or fully identify will take the space of what hydro is covering now.
Yeah, the Penobscot River Restoration Project was a great collaboration between our tribe and the state, and they removed 3 dams, and we've had, I think, 12 species of fish come back up toward Indian Island, and salmon has been one of them. So I'm in favor of removing dams as well.
Yeah, I don't have much to add, and definitely am not an expert either, but I will say that hydro is an incredibly complicated issue. In terms of the difference between small dams and mega hydro that we're seeing up in Quebec, and I think I'll leave it at that. I don't want to get into a big debate about hydro.
So a question that a couple of people have asked, and it stems from the fact that we are a lot of Maine is very rural, and will Mainers be reluctant to depend on electricity for transportation and home heating when our electric grid is not terribly reliable? And if that is the case, how do we change that reluctance?
I guess Hannah, do you want to go first? Or I guess I can just jump in and say that it is going to be a tough sale, right? Selling electric vehicle or zero emitting vehicles to many in Maine because of the price points. But as Hannah pointed out, they're coming down, and they'll continue to come down. And also what rural Mainers will realize is that the benefits of an electric vehicle or a zero emitting vehicle is double what the benefits would be for a suburban or urban driver. So they'll save twice as much money. Rural Mainers will save twice as much money when they transition to electric vehicles. As far as the grid is a real challenge. We're going to have a grid in 30 years that's probably 3 times as large or built out and more robust. But in building it out, it'll be more reliable. We'll make sure that it's a grid that's more reliable and resilient to more extreme weather. The expectation weather storms are only going to get worse over the next couple of decades. So we want to ensure as we invest in beneficial electrification, and this goes hand in hand with the heat pumps and the EV infrastructure installations that will take place with hopefully a lot of federal money now that President Biden is committed to support these kinds of investments. This will make it a much more resilient and stronger grid across the state, So rural Mainers and even urban suburban Mainers won't have the kind of power outages that we suffer today, because we'll have a much stronger grid as well as more electrification to service our needs.
And honestly, we haven't talked about it a lot tonight, but there's a lot happening in Washington, D.C. right now on the issues of climate and infrastructure. And, you know, we all watched on TV what happened in Texas, and clearly a major failure of the electric grid. You know, people lost their lives. And I think people in Maine, you know, we've certainly seen instances with major ice storms. I mean, I will just point out many Mainers heat their homes with electric furnaces, which also require the grid. So the transition to electric heating systems isn't really a major change. You know, a lot of rural Mainers have backup wood stoves and may continue to do that. But I think as David pointed out, I mean, the future of a grid and a modern grid and a grid that works in a large rural state is the most important thing for a lot of our electrification goals. So I think there is a focus on modern utilities, on holding them accountable, making sure that it's affordable, and also making sure it's, you know, not as reliant on huge grid, like things like microgrids, storage in people's homes. I mean, there are ways that we can make our grid more resilient with sort of new innovative solutions. So there's a huge focus on this in Washington. There's a potential for major grid infrastructure funding that could go to all the states. And a state like Maine would really need to make sure we use that wisely. You know, we have an entire northern county of our state not connected to the grid in the southern part of the Maine. And that's actually a challenge for economic opportunity when it comes to renewable energy. So focus on the grid. It's not sexy. It's, you know, a lot of issues that frankly are super complicated but they require our focus. And over the next 10 years, when we think about getting this right, really modernizing our grid to work for the people of Maine is one of the least sexy but most important things we need to do.
I'll just add on the grassroots side of things. There are a couple efforts going on both regionally and in the state of Maine in terms of fixing our grid. One is a regional campaign called Fix the Grid, working on some of that infrastructure work. And another here in Maine is called Our Power, and it's a grassroots effort to create a consumer-owned utility in the state of Maine, which you know, would help with that, expanding the grid 3 times that David was talking about.
Fantastic. So one more question. How are we working with neighboring states to address climate change? We've talked a lot about what Maine is doing, but we're part of a much larger community. How are we working with the other states in New England and throughout the nation to address climate change?
Yeah, I'll start on that one. I mean, I would say when the governor took office, she joined the U.S. Climate Alliance, which is now a group of more than 25 states really trying to be leaders on climate. And first, our goal was to meet the Paris climate goals when Trump pulled the U.S. out, and now it is to push the whole country to be as aggressive as possible. So that group has been incredibly helpful to the state of Maine. You know, really detailed policy work happening with lots of state officials and stakeholders. But obviously, you know, we know Maine's emissions as a part of the overall national emissions is very small. And, you know, the impacts of climate for, you know, our fishermen, for our communities, for our, you know, vulnerable people on the front line, it's not going to be because just of Maine's emissions. Maine's emissions are a small part. So we need to be part of a national movement, and the governor has really pushed that. You know, again, that's why she went to the UN in 2019 and started with the message, Maine won't wait. We need to go faster, farther for the sake of our people. You know, the governor is interested in going to Glasgow to the UN COP, where we really hope that the US will make a major commitment and start to push countries around the world. There's lots of, again, detailed efforts. David mentioned RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative. There's other interstate conversations on cars, on forest sequestration that we're a part of. So, you know, and even our energy grid, we are part of ISO New England. We are part of a a grid infrastructure that is not just Maine, it is all the New England states. So we cannot do this alone. If we did everything right, climate change would come just as fast. So we really need to figure out how to help lead. And I think that we've taken some big steps in the last 2 years. And again, I think everyone on this Zoom screen has been a part of that. So, I'm grateful for the state's leadership, and we have to keep pushing further and harder.
Just add a bit to what Hannah just said as well. Speaking regionally, she mentioned ISO New England. The governor's energy office just came out with a report on the most effective way, quite frankly, from a market's perspective to meet the state's renewable portfolio standard. And one of those is about regional transmission. And as Hannah mentioned as well, Northern Maine would benefit from a transmission line that connected Northern Maine, where there are tremendous opportunities for renewable energy, particularly wind and solar, connecting to not only New England states regionally, but also to Canada. So you can see where Maine would benefit from generating, and that's a regional approach to covering the costs of a costly initiative. Although I know there's some pending legislation which may address that. The other thing I would just add, and I know the governor is possibly looking to do this during her second term, is not only is the regional greenhouse gas initiative effective, as both I and Hannah have mentioned, in terms of capping power plant emissions and then taking the resources that polluters pay to be permitted to pollute, to invest in climate solutions. There's a transportation climate initiative that's underway that's regional. And it's attempting to do the same thing. And I think in time that, we in Maine will realize that's a good program ultimately for the state, and will provide probably $150, $160 million a year to invest in, much of it in rural communities throughout the state. So that's an important program to take a look at. Although I would hope that even that might be obviated by the federal government at some point, putting forward a national carbon pricing initiative that really raises a lot more revenue to be distributed. So instead of a cap and invest, it's really just an investment, a revenue raising and investment program that would drive down emissions and drive a lot more money into solutions. And that could be obviously it'd be much more effective beyond a regional approach, but a national approach. There are a number of bills that look good, and there are bills that deal with regressivity of the tax. You want to make sure that those who might be harmed by such a tax are addressed, their concerns and their needs are addressed, and then the rest of the money is invested in solutions.
Thanks. So we're getting near the end, and so I'm now going to invite all four of our panelists to share their closing thoughts. So, panelists, in a few words, what would you say is the single most important action that our audience can do to solve climate in Maine? No pressure here, but what is the single most important action that we can do to solve climate? And let's start with Director Pingree.
I was hoping to not be first because it's such an impossible question. This is not the only thing you should do, but I've been listening to a podcast called How to Save the Planet, and I encourage you to check it out. It's really good. And they recently had something about your carbon footprint, and it sort of debated collective action versus individual action. And clearly on climate, like no one individual action any one of us take, especially, if we don't run, we're not the president, we don't run large corporations. It's a blip in the actual carbon emissions of this country and world. But it really does, it emphasized that really both are important, and that every one of us needs to think about what is the thing I can do in my sphere that can make a difference. Because the reality of our Maine climate plan is we have to do all the things. We have to, over the next 10 years, make sure EVs are more affordable and then convince people to drive them. We need to increase funding for public transportation. We need to weatherize homes and focus on low-income homeowners. I mean, as government officials, my job is to do all the things, and we need to do all the things to even get close to where we need to be in 2030 and then 2050. So really, individually, what can each person do? It is sort of, read the plan, climatecouncil.maine.gov, follow what's happening in Washington and in the world on these issues, And then think about what is your sphere of influence. You know, do you talk your parents into something? Do you talk your university into something? Do you write your governor? Do you write your US senator as they debate this huge infrastructure climate bill? What is the thing that you can do? And again, all the things are important, so I really can't pick one, but I would just say, you know, keep the urgency on and think about the things that you can do individually. And some of those may be collective action, some of them may be individual, and they really are all important. So that's not a great answer, Charles, but I'll pass it off to whoever's next.
Okay. Thanks, Hannah. Ambassador Dana.
Great, I'll be quick. You can support the recognition of inherent tribal sovereignty in Maine, and you can check out wabanakiealliance.com and sign up for our email list, or you can learn about the legislative efforts and beyond. We really want to advocate about education around tribal issues and why sovereignty and stewardship is good for the tribes and good for all of Maine.
Okay. On your right.
Get educated and get involved. A book that I'm going to recommend to everyone tonight is a book called All We Can Save. It's a book of essays by women leading the climate movement in the United States, including an essay from Sherry Mitchell, who is a citizen of the Penobscot and Passamaquoddy Nation. It's a great book if you're looking for a place to just learn about the issue of climate change in general. And then get involved, join Maine Youth for Climate Justice or Maine Environmental Changemakers if you're a young person, or if you're an adult, look for, Sierra Club Maine, Natural Resources Council of Maine, other statewide orgs or community efforts that you can plug into. I think something that I like to say to folks who are wondering how they can get involved is that there is a need for everyone in the climate movement because it's going to take everyone to solve it. So whether you're an artist or a writer or someone who's just looking to be, told what to do, there's a space for you in this movement, and we need you. So yeah, get educated and get involved.
And David.
I guess the easiest answer is to be on your right. I think young people should emulate what Anya's doing. The kind of passion, energy, and what she's dedicated to this cause already has been tremendous. And also run for political office. Do what Hannah has done. I think it's important. This is a political challenge. Again, we need to marshal political support and the political will to make the changes that science has already identified needs to occur. It needs to occur soon. And you do that by starting young, being as active as Anya is. And then when Anya turns, 26, I'm not sure what Anya's, I know she's younger than that, then run for office and get all your friends to do the same thing. And I think those are the two most important things that people can do. And if you can't get active, obviously support those who are. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you. Thank you to all four of our panelists. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for taking the time to talk to us. And thank you to all of our audience members. Thank you for the insightful questions and comments. I hope that I was able to communicate some of that interest to the panelists. I think this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for all that you have done. And now I'm going to turn it over to Bethany Woodworth, who's going to follow up and talk a little bit about next year's event, because this is just the start. So Bethany?
I'm here. Just give me a moment. So thank you so much, Charles, for doing such a nice job of moderating tonight. And thank you to all of our panelists and our audience. I want to say thank you as well. I found it to be a really interesting and a very thought-provoking evening, and I'm glad we recorded it because I need to go back and absorb more. We hope that all of you in the audience feel inspired and empowered to take these suggestions from our panelists and find your own path to helping solve climate change. But you don't have to do it alone. We hope that you feel supported by this community and the many other communities here in Maine working on this problem. Next year, the Solve Climate by 2030 event is planned to be an international network of teach-ins at all levels, As I noted a lot of questions in the chat from educators. This is an opportunity for you to get involved, perhaps host a teach-in at your own high school, middle school, college, or community center. And I hope that you'll join us then to take all of this work to the next level. Thank you to everybody and have a great evening.